Welcome to Working Mama, the podcast for women navigating the juggle of career and motherhood. If returning to work after maternity leave, trying to figure out how to make all of this work, or just need someone to say out loud what you've been thinking, you're in the right place. So glad you're here. Whether you're a regular listener or this is your first time, let's get into it. Today, we're talking about something I don't think gets nearly enough airtime. And that is, how do you actually know when it's time to increase your days at work? Because most of the conversation about returning to work after maternity leave is about the return itself, the very first day back, the transition, the dropping off at childcare, surviving the mental load of suddenly having to be both mum and a professional again. But what about that moment, 6 months in, 12 months in, when something starts to shift? When you start to get into your routine, and then you start wondering if the arrangement you came back on now fits your life. And that's what we're going to unpack today. I'm also going to share with you my own story because honestly, it's the thing I wish someone had talked to me about as I return back to work for both my first and second children. I'll look at the same just quickly. I've got 2 kids. I had 2 pregnancies about 2.5 years apart, and I had for my first son, 10 months maternity leave, and for my second, I had 13 months maternity leave. That's just some context also just to get into the episode. When I returned from maternity leave the first time, I came back 3 days a week to the same employer, although my role had changed and I was doing a slightly different job. And honestly, that felt the right amount of time of working 3 days. I was figuring out the juggle, getting back into the rhythm of work, settling my son into childcare, and 3 days gave me that breathing room. I kept for about the 2.5 years, the whole time between my first and second children, I worked 3 days. Then I had my second son. It was during COVID. And when I returned after my second maternity leave, I made the same call. I'd go back 3 days. But I also knew by that point that 2 kids was going to be it for us. The baby making machine was over. I've got 2 kids earthside. I've been pregnant 4 times. So I knew that I was done. And in some ways, I also really wanted to hold on to that time because also what we hear of, when they're young, they only last for so long. And 3 days felt intentional. It felt like I was protecting our time together. And you know what? For a while, that worked. But then something started to happen. I'd be on a non-work day, a day where I wasn't being paid, and a meeting might come up, or I'd be answering an email that I needed to get back to ideally on that day. And slowly, I was needing more than 3 days to actually do my work. And I also started noticing that my workload wasn't actually a 3-day workload anymore. I'd been back about 6 months after my second maternity leave, and I took on extra responsibility at an Asia Pacific role, which I look back now was a hell of a lot of work. I was recognized for it, but clearly it wasn't for 3 days. And I think a lot of women will recognize that moment, that slow creep where the work doesn't stop at the edges of your contracted days. It just spills into the spaces around you, in your non-work days, into your evenings, and potentially also that Sunday spiral. For me, that moment of clarity came when I was sitting at my non-work day in a meeting, not getting paid. I was on a Teams call with some colleagues. I had one son writing on a whiteboard with some markers. I had another one who wasn't feeling 100%, clutching at my ankles, wanting to be picked up. And I think he also wanted to be part of the call. I had someone say, sounds like there's a lot going on there. Little did they know, it was my non-paid work day. It was a Friday when I generally didn't work. And I was just like, oh my goodness. It was that moment of going, this is not sustainable. This is not working. And I was thinking I probably should be getting paid for all this extra work anyway. And it wasn't just about the payment. I knew that I had 2 kids and that I knew eventually I probably would actually look at going up to 4 days. And it was one of those things of, is this the moment? It wasn't a dramatic light bulb. It wasn't a crisis. It was just a quiet practical thought. And that's how often these things arrive, isn't it? It's not a big announcement, just as a slow accumulation of evidence that something needs to change. And I knew in that moment, I had this thought come in going, oof, is this the moment that I need to really start considering going from 3 to 4 days? But here's the thing, I didn't do anything about it straight away. I actually let it sit there, and I let it sit in my thought process for a few months. I just gnarled over it and thinking, okay, and went through the different scenarios. Well, how would this work? How would that be? Managing, some of the mum guilt. What does it look like? And there is a lot of those societal things. Well, they're young, spend as much time with them as what you possibly can. And I look back now with my children, now 5 and 8, going, I really enjoy the time no matter what age they are. So I think it's also about carving out the life that you want, no matter if they are 18 months or, 15 years old. And as I say, as a 5 and 8-year-old mum, every moment is precious. It's not just when they're young, but there's so much about, I think that's also put on to us of when they're young, you've got to spend as much time as possible with them. And I think it's also worth naming because there's a lot of pressure around these decisions. And I think also from ourselves more than anyone else to also act immediately or dismiss the thought entirely. But I also think there's a wisdom in sitting with something, in letting yourself feel it out before you say it out loud. As I said, processing it. What's this going to look like? Even journaling it. And, it's something that was in the back of my mind and I didn't really make any rash decisions. So here's what the process actually looked like for me. First, I let myself think about it privately for a while, just me processing whether this was going to be a real feeling or a moment of frustration. I then talked to my husband, not asking for permission, but more of like a reality check to get his thoughts. Would 4 days work logistically for our family? What would need to shift? And it's a conversation that is definitely worth having before you walk into your manager's office, because the answer affects your whole household and not just your work calendar availability. I then talked to 2 of my really close friends and just working through some of the ideas and the thoughts with them. We usually, when our kids were younger, actually caught up every Monday at a different park around Melbourne. And it's amazing what we solved in those playground catch-ups between conversations and pushing kids on swings. But they were my confident people of going, okay, what do you reckon? This is what my thought process is. They didn't really have opinions one way or another, but they allowed me to talk about it and actually to get it out into the open. They also allowed me to be honest with myself and not also tell me what I just wanted to hear. And it was then when I had spoken to different people, I had actually worked through it in my own mind, did I then have the conversation with my manager, which I reckon was about 5 months after I had the initial thought. And I want to be honest, I was really lucky. My manager was genuinely supportive. She made it clear that she'd be happy with whatever I wanted to work because they were keen to have me as part of the organisation. But, look, she said, maybe eventually you will work up to 5 days, but she said, look, I'm very happy if you take on 4. And she's a mum herself, and so she completely understood. And I am actually talking about the CEO here. And that kind of honesty helped me feel more respected and more supported in the organisation and not less. It wasn't manipulative. It was actually a really honest and supportive conversation, and I really appreciate that. Now, I also want to talk about the guilt because, trust me, of course it's there. And going from 3 to 4 days as a mum of 2, there's a voice that showed up and actually saying, is this the right call? Are you taking something away from your kids? Should you not spend all the time possible with your young children? And aren't you going to be missing out on things? But here's what I found. And I want to say this clearly because I think it matters. The time that I spent with my kids became more about quality over quantity. And they were getting then the best version of myself. I wasn't as stressed. I wasn't as stretched. I was focused. I found that I was looking at my email less. I was more intentional about what we were doing. And I have to say, I actually enjoyed the time together way more. I don't know, everyone's going to have a different view. But for me, I actually found, because I knew that I didn't have all this time in the world, and I knew that my son was going to school in about 12 months' time, that this was our time, that we needed to make the most of it. But I've then subsequently, then I had a couple of years where my now 5-year-old, who's actually doing kinder now, and I'm not available anymore on a Monday, unfortunately, but we had a day together. Yes, we still caught up with friends at the park, but we also did things just us. And even to this day, he says, Mum, I just want a day with you and I. Yes, that does pull at the heartstrings and make things at times quite difficult, particularly with childcare drop-off. But I also knew that there wasn't this leftover day that I could, oh, look, that's fine. What are we going to do? It was our day. And so it's one of those things of quality over quantity. And you speak to different parenting people like Jen Muir and even Maggie Dent. They say you don't have to be perfect or even try to be perfect. There's no such thing. But even if you're trying to get it right, I think it's about 30 or 40% of the time. And actually, spending that time, that's what matters. That's what the kids need. So I think also that notion you need to be there 100% of the time. I actually, as I said, I found that it was quality over quantity. But also what I noticed is that on 3 days, I was half in, half out my days off of checking emails and, still thinking about work. But then when I went to 4 days, I was actually, as I said, a lot more settled. I was present at home because I'd given work the time that it's needed. And I found that it's been the best of both worlds. But I know and I acknowledge that it's not always the story, but this was mine. And I think it's worth sharing because we often assume that more days at work automatically means less for our kids. But also sometimes it means less guilt, less bleed, you've got better boundaries, and also you're more intentional with the time that you do have. So let's get practical, because I know that some of you are sitting here with a version of this question right now. Here are the signals worth paying attention to. Number 1, your workload doesn't fit your contracted days. If you're regularly working on days that you're not paid for, or your to-do list is actually never clearing, that's not a time management problem. That's often a capacity mismatch, and certainly pay attention to it. Number 2, you're checking emails on your days off more than you're present. If the boundaries are already blurry, formalizing an extra day can actually create more clarity and not less time at home. 3, the idea has been sitting in your head for more than a few weeks. When something keeps coming back, it's usually worth listening to. Give yourself permission to explore it without immediately deciding, and even journaling or speaking to close friends could help. Number 4, your kids' needs are shifting. The arrangement that worked when your baby was 6 months old might be not what works at 2, 3, or even when school starts. And trust me, school's a whole other ballgame. Your days at work don't have to stay frozen because that's what you decided on your first day back, returning from maternity leave. And as kids get older, they have way more sports activities. So I have to say, childcare days, so much easier. And number 5, you've done the practical maths. Childcare costs, family logistics, increasing mortgages. Does it all work financially? Does it work practically? These questions matter too. And it often isn't just an emotional decision. And if you get to the point where you're ready to have the conversation at work, a few things I'd suggest. Come in with a clear ask, not a question. So, for example, you'd say to your manager, I'd like to increase to 4 days. And this is very different conversation to I'm thinking about maybe potentially going up a day. Knowing what you're asking for before you sit down and knowing what you'll take as a non-negotiable. Frame it in terms of workload and where it's relevant. If you can articulate that your current contracted days don't match the actual scope of your role, that's a business case, not just a personal request. And that shift in framing matters. And if your manager responds the way that mine did, with transparency about the organisation would like, but also being supportive, try to receive that as honesty, not pressure. You're allowed to hear it, fact it in, and still make the decision that's right for you. What I want you to take from this episode is that the arrangement you came back on from when you returned with maternity leave doesn't have to be permanent. Things evolve, financial situations evolve. You also evolve on what you want from your career, but also the mum you want to be. The decisions you made at 12 weeks postpartum, exhausted and terrified about going back, don't have to define the next 5, 10, 15 years of your career. You're allowed to reassess. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to want more days, fewer days, different days, more flexible work arrangements, and to advocate for what you actually need. Give yourself some grace and give yourself the same grace you would give a friend who is trying to figure this out. And if you're sitting with a quiet thought right now, some version of, I think I need to change something, I'd encourage you to just let yourself sit with it. Talk to your husband, talk to a friend, and when you're ready to have the conversation, you might be surprised how much clearer things feel on the other side. Thanks as always for listening to Working Mama. If this episode resonated, I'd love for you to share it with a fellow working mum who would need to hear it. And come find me on Instagram at Working Mama Community or at Working Mama Podcast. And I'd also love to know if this is something that you're navigating right now, or if you've got any other questions or topics you would love me to discuss on the podcast. Just send me a DM. Until next time, have a great day, and please know you're not alone. We're in it with you.